All right, we'll just be coming out of election day and midterm season when this is published. Have you been keeping an eye, keeping all of the politics at arm's length? What's been your
I
approach?
keep a side eye on it.
Yeah.
I'm not immersed in it, but I think you have to keep, some tabs on it just so you can, it moves so quickly. You got to keep some tabs on it.
I've been disillusioned by so much of the conversation surrounding politics and voting and this democracy, but I think community really is what has kept me engaged at all. The sense of community that
Mm.
some candidates have been able to create. It's an important thing as affirmed by our friends at the Schubert Club. Since 1882, Schubert Club has been cultivating a passion for music and fosters an engaged community of music enthusiasts through concerts, music education, museum exhibits, and student scholarships. I'll speak a little bit more to what the Schubert Club has going on here in a minute, but it's that word community that really is driving me and my continued engagement, as little as it is, with the political system, because community really is all we have at the end of the day. If we're
Right.
if we're talking about solidarity, if we're talking about initiative, community really does it. And I'm very excited about how Schubert Club sort of just as they say in their mission, cultivates that community and creates opportunity and puts different people on. It just so happens that Schubert Club, through their music museum mini series, I've done one about what the bassoon is. There are all sorts of those,
Hmm.
and one of them was recorded back in the spring, featuring our friend Maria Issa, a member of the TRILLOQUY family, and our soon to be, at least where I live, our soon to be state representative. Following her campaign, collaborating with her, fostering a friendship, connecting with her on the Buddhist front, because she also chants Nam
Mm.
Myoho Renge Kyo.
Mm.
It has, brought in the human element of this whole conversation of who are we voting for and who's endorsed by a party and all of those different things. When I go to the poll to vote for her tomorrow, tomorrow as we're recording this, I'm not just voting for the Democrat or the progressive or the person that I think I should vote for. I'm voting for an individual who I really believe in.
Hmm.
It's incredible. And not only, through her activism and what she does for the community, but again, her music is incredible. She did a Schubert Club music museum mini featuring the conga and teaching us a little bit about bamba. I wanted to share just a little bit of her presentation as she's, trying to get the kids in particular to understand the different sounds of the drum and how you can utilize it. Here's a little bit of
Where you
this.
go in and bass. So try hitting the bass. Tanka tunku tunku tum bass. Tanka tunku tunku tum bass. Tanka tunku tunku tum bass.
You had some experience down in Florida playing percussion, said that your hands got beat up pretty good. So has she got calloused up hands from her percussion playing?
I don't know if she has callous hands, but she plays the drum well, and I know what it takes to play the drum after doing that.
One
So
thing I will say is very cool. I've seen her videos, at like celebrations, after parties, and things like that. And she gets out there and dances,
she does
and
it all. She's an incredible singer, of course,
and
a rapper, as we've talked about.
yeah, I appreciate that. It's not, let's just say it. It's not a stuffed shirt that, is going to come up and say thank you and then leave.
And it's not a stuffed shirt that's going to be, creating policy and
Hmm.
and helping,
Hmm.
us make it
Get
here on
that.
the state level. I don't know. Do you think the unhumanity of politics, and again, by that I mean just the lack of true rapport and knowledge and proximity of these individuals to communities, do you think that is really what the issue is? If
I
we can
do.
start to know who these people are,
I
will
do.
will there be more faith in the system and in voting, in results, all of that?
Maybe I'm looking at it from a slightly different position than what you're talking about right now, because with my family, I'm having conversations where I'm trying to get them to say, okay, now you hear this news story. Is that humane that you just heard, is that being, good to, my family are Christian people. And I have to ask them, does that follow what the scripture says or what your books say? Where's the humanity in this, in what you just observed?
I think if we're just really going to be honest and raw about it, there are people who just don't care about the humanity of other people. It seems like that is what has to be taught.
That's what's sad.
or engaged.
Yeah, and it feels like it's growing, right?
The lack of
does.
humanity, seeing each other's
everybody
human
out
spirit.
for themselves. Yeah, it does feel like that.
Okay, so if that's really what we have to do, it's not about the candidates and knowing the candidates. It's about seeing each other as humans.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything in your mind that can help do that? The door knocking isn't always going to be safe, so it's not about that. So
the candidates and the people in power need to stop the hot rhetoric. They need to calm people rather than stir them up and gin up stories that creates a narrative that isn't 100% accurate.
It's not about rhetoric. It's not about messaging as much as it needs to be about dialogue. I think there's a lot of talking at people instead of talking with people.
And show some leadership. Stand up there and say, look, this isn't right what we're doing, and we need to stop othering one another, and we can disagree, but this violence, man, is scary.
We say that all the time. We can disagree and still be friends, or
I'm not
still
saying
be
you got to be
humane,
friends
or whatever, or be cordial, whatever. But there are just, I guess where my struggle comes in is that there are a number of things that I don't think it's acceptable to believe. So if we disagree, for example, on the importance of Black life or the fact that Black lives matter, that's not just okay, well, we can agree to disagree. That's
I get that.
where we're getting into values. But I guess again, that circles back to seeing the human nature, just the humanness of the next person. And if you can't do that, how can things move forward? Well, I guess I'm going to get a little bit into that in the Trilloquy today, in the fourth movement, but at the end of it all, it's about dialogue. Again, not just talking at each other, but really working hard to understand different perspectives that are not yours, and what comes from those perspectives, whether it be ways of life, political beliefs, the way that you teach and engage your children, even the way you listen to music. It's that dialogue that we try to engage here so that we can see something in common and move forward together. That's my spiel today. Should I run for office? Do I sound like I can please enough of the masses?
With all your time. Yeah.
They would dig up some skeletons about me. And anyway, again, a little bit more of that in the fourth movement. But for now, let's go ahead and jump in. I'm Garrett McQueen.
I'm Scott Blankenship.
And this is Trilloquy, Opus 173. Thank you so much for joining us. To returning listeners, we couldn't do it without you. Your support keeps this podcast afloat, and we are extremely grateful for your continued support. If this is your first time checking out the Trilloquy podcast, Trilloquy is a show that takes the phrase classical music, the concept of classical music, and turns it on its head. We take stories, we take pieces of music, songs, orchestral compositions, anything that you can think of, and we contextualize it as classical music, sometimes American classical music or whatever culture it comes from, all the way to the end goal of decolonizing that phrase classical music and creating a music ecosystem that genuinely reaches the ideals and perspectives of more people. If you want to check out more on the Trilloquy podcast, listen to past opuses, contribute to the project, you can do all of that at our website, Trilloquy, TRILLOQY.org. In addition to your very generous support for the Trilloquy podcast comes from Schubert Club. Coming up on the 18th of this month of November, we have Our Song, Our Story, the new generation of Black voices. It's an evening evening celebrating the world's most well-known arias, art songs, and spirituals, created and directed by composer, conductor, and multi-genre musician Damien Sneed. You can find more information about that at the Schubert Club website, as well as their upcoming Kids Jam coming up on November 29th. It's themed around a journey through Afro-Brazilian music with Ticket to Brazil. It says here, listen to and learn about the exciting and energetic music of Brazil. Create your own percussion instrument and play along with cello, guitar, flute, and more percussion. Again, all of that at schubert.org. Huge thanks to all of our friends over there at Schubert Club. Elijah Daniel Smith is coming in the third movement, part one of our conversation. You know, Elijah Daniel Smith, Scott, is one of those composers who I was talking a little bit of shit about. And then, of course, when you meet them in person, I'm like, so now I'm stammering. So see, now I'm in trouble.
What was that?
Now, yeah, that comes up in the interview. So I forget if it's this week or it'll be next week. But Elijah's coming up in the third movement. In the second movement, I'm bringing in some Anita Baker. You're going to talk a little bit about Mimi Parker.
Mm-hmm.
As I mentioned in the fourth movement, I'm going to call myself to the carpet a little bit. We're going to have some of these cross-community conversations that need to be had for us all to move forward. But before all of that, movement one. Let's get into it. All right. Well, you offered an accidental this week that I figured you would bring in because you're pretty good at keeping your ear to the ground. You already said that you're on Twitter, making sure that you stay up to date with the slang and the happenings.
That's a part-time job.
So give it to us. What accidental you giving us this week?
From Rolling Stone, this gets a shark. The headline is, "This is Black Caviar of Hip Hop. Rick Ross turns up with an all-black orchestra. The luxurious sounds of Maybach music took over the Atlanta Symphony Hall as part of Red Bull's Global Symphonic Series. Red Bull caught wind of them through their, quote, Beethoven Meets the 90s Vibe show." Another show that I've not heard of.
that sounds interesting to you, huh?
I want to see what they're talking about. He says, "I feel like for the first time in my life, I'm me." He's tasked with translating an hour of Roger's discography into music for his orchestra. Rogers says the arrangements poured out of him.
The show seemed lit. I don't think, if someone hears about Rick Ross or any rapper with an orchestra, that it's gonna sell. I've had the pleasure of performing with the Philharmonic for many years. We have Nas, who's been out here with orchestras for a long time. Those shows always do well. I know the rapper Common is doing a lot of work trying to get in front of more orchestras. We have the 50th anniversary of hip hop coming up next year, August 11th. I think the date is hip hop will turn 50 years old. So, I'm sure every orchestra that has a little taste of cultural competency will be figuring out how they can engage that. And not to say that this isn't happening, the sort of hip hop orchestral music blend isn't happening. I want to shout out the Wheeling Symphony Orchestra in Wheeling, West Virginia, a suburb of Pittsburgh. It's in the Pittsburgh area. They they premiered a beatbox concerto this season, which I thought was really cool. And, in my work with ACO, we're working to see if we can figure out some collaborations to continue that momentum. But, again, just to, not to make the conversation negative or anything, but when we start talking about why certain things don't happen or why things are a norm, you can't take the racial element out of it. We're talking about hip hop music for goodness sake. And I do think that is an ingredient in a lot of folks' aversion because they're thinking about their traditional audience and how the fur coats and the pearls aren't interested in hearing any of that. But there is an audience for it. I think that is what's even more important. And this new audience or this newer audience should be engaged and should have things programmed toward them, toward us, I should say. So I'm celebrating this.
Last week or the week before, you asked how much money I would pay to go to an opera.
Yeah, and you said $100.
Well, you know what? I looked at some of the pricing structures. And after I bought, there was some of them that after I bought the ticket, I might have money for parking.
Oh, okay. or a glass of wine at intermission.
I don't even know about that. I don't know about. I know
you say because it was up there the $89 range. So,
so my question would be, who would you want to see on stage in front of an orchestra? Because, we said Speaker Geekers pointed out that Rick Ross is symphonic at his core. So think about that. What artist do you think would sound good in front of an orchestra, and what would you pay to go sit and listen?
Well, I'm thinking about classical, so-called classical versus classic hip hop. So I think it would be cool to see an Eric B. and Rakim in front of an orchestra, or even going a little later, Queen Latifah and these folks in front of an orchestra. And it could be cool to see some of these lulz run around here in front of an orchestra. So I don't know. I think my point is just that the idea of it needs to be way more normalized. We talk about Pink Martini and how they bring that sort of, show club cabaret to the orchestra. We talk about movies and video games and the orchestra all the time. We're kind of talking about hip hop and orchestras. It's still few and far between. And I just hope that we can make it more of a normal concept, so that more of it is happening in the mainstream more often.
I think it's an interesting distinction to make, your willingness to put out some money if it's Black Noir and an artist that you want to hear, versus X City Orchestra presents Lil.
I mean, if Orchestra Noir is coming through Minnesota, or I'm somewhere where they're performing, I feel an obligation to support. I feel, like I need to give, everything I can to do what I can to just support this group. I don't need to reach deep into my pocket for a New York Philharmonic or even for a Minnesota orchestra, because, I'm not their core audience. They have a budget that is very good, larger than TRILLOQUY's budget for sure. So I think there's that aspect of it as well. It's not just about, I don't know. I'm just mindful of where the money is going, not just the experience I'm having, but where those dollars are going. Anyway,
I get that.
Huge shout out and congratulations to everyone at Orchestra Noir. I hope we can see more of this moving forward. So I went around, I did a little bit of searching to see if there's some instrumental or so-called classical takes on the music of Rick Ross. And I did actually find something. I found a recording here of pianist David Hoffman performing an arrangement of a Rick Ross tune called Aston Martin Music. So we'll listen to a little bit of this to get us to our next accidental. Michelle are featured in the original of that track alongside Rick Ross. But as we repeat, as I talk about a lot on this podcast, I can make a case for the straight up hip hop tracks fitting into what we should be considering classical music, fit into that conversation. And I'm growing softer on my approach when it comes to benchmarks being the way forward. To me, I think it's very easy to make a case for a benchmark like a piano arrangement of a hip hop tune in the spaces, especially in classical radio, just to normalize, again, as I was saying, the concept of that Venn diagramming of hip hop and so-called classical music. The recording that we just heard, I'm sure you could write a really great break, and you would go on the Wikipedia or whatever you have to do of Rick Ross, come up with a break or talk about a conversation we've had. And now there is a listener who has never heard of Rick Ross who is now curious, and maybe there's a rude email in there every now and again. But I also believe that there will be that one listener, even if just one listener, who happens to have the classical radio station on because they're trying to study or they're trying to sleep or the baby's in the car or whatever. But to their core, they're a hip hop fan. being seen in that way is completely invaluable. So think about what they'll tell their friends that they heard on the classical radio station and what they'll tell their friends and their
That's the
friends.
hope.
It's just those seeds that we have to make the effort to plant. Now, sometimes we when we talk about equity, we're talking about the extra work that requires. A lot of these hip hop artists are very stingy about their music, even arrangements of their music. So that means now that the arts institutions have to start engaging a different community of music makers and producers and the legal part of it for the sake of that cultural competency, for the sake of that broader community engagement. I love that it's happening, that folks like Rolling Stone are covering it. We still have a long way to go, I think, when it comes to really normalizing that Black aesthetic in any classical space.
Yeah, I get that
It
too.
happens.
Yeah.
It's still not normalized.
Right. I get that too.
All right. Well, I have an accidental this week. I'm going to give it, you know what? I'm just going to have to go ahead and give it a flat because of the harm that I see being done from the outside. I'm reading here from the Baltimore Sun. The headline is "Real Life," REEL, Real Life, or Real Life, REAL. New film Tar appears to borrow from former Baltimore Symphony conductor Marin Alsop's biography. The headline itself was a little shocking to me because everything that people are telling me about this movie Tar that I have not seen and you have not seen yet is about a bad conductor who gets her due, who has to pay the piper. I literally have not even read a synopsis of the film. I like to go into movies as blind as I can, but to understand the story of this movie and that being paired to Marin Alsop, someone who I celebrate as a great conductor, as a great change maker. It was a little surprising to me. Well, what were your initial reactions to learning that folks are making those comparisons here?
Like you, I have not read the synopsis. I haven't watched a trailer apart from, something that gets on TV when I'm going up to go to the bathroom or something like that.
Yeah.
Maybe a snippet here or there. I always worry whenever they put out a movie about classical music because of what it's going to prop up. Right?
Yeah.
So I don't know Marin Alsop's story. I didn't even know she had a biography out. So maybe there's a winter reading list edition.
Sure.
I don't know. But I do understand what she's talking about, in that she feels like she's picking up pieces now, because here comes this film where things are a little bit too on the nose with some of the things from her biography, and people watch the film and all of a sudden they're slowly turning and looking at her. And she has to go, no, wait a minute.
Let me read a little bit from this article just to give some context for folks who don't know. It says here, Tar, the buzzy new feature film starring Cate Blanchett about a pioneer and predatory female classical music conductor, has become an unwelcome and troubling distraction for Marin Alsop, the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra's music director laureate. The movie is entirely fictitious, as the writer-director Todd Field makes clear. But not only has the character of Lydia Tarr seemingly been fleshed out with details from Alsop's biography, the film mentions Marin Alsop by name. Field's protagonist, again, this is the writer of the film, the protagonist, quote, clearly is based on Alsop, the New York Times recently concluded. So it's not just hearsay or people whispering, oh, maybe this is about Marin Alsop. We have actual newspapers and real critics saying that obviously this film director wrote this movie about Marin Alsop. Predatory is just, again, a word that I would not approximate to Marin Alsop. When she stepped down from her position with the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, as we talked about here on TRILLOQUY, my memory was that there was this ivory tower, a phrase that she used that she could not budge.
Yep.
So now, months later, maybe even a year later, I forget when that was, we have a movie that many people are identifying as being based on much of her life story, and she's painted as the bad person. I think it's very telling. It's very interesting.
She thinks that too. She says, because it appears the screenwriter read about my life and decided to use some superficial details from my life to write the script, I am in the unfortunate position of having to contend with many questions about the fictional character of Tar and Todd Field's film created without my knowledge or consent. I get that.
So
I get that.
one thing that we do know is that no matter what, people love the mess.
Yep.
They may not show up for Beethoven, but they go show up for some mess.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that? Well, I feel like I don't even have to ask you. It seems like that was not lost on the creators of this film. That if they made a movie about this woman conductor who faced adversity and ended up triumphing overall, yeah, there would be some people interested in that. But what people are more interested in is seeing a conductor fall, even if it's a woman conductor.
Mm-hmm.
As it's always said in showbiz, the only thing that people love more than the come up is the fall off.
Yep.
And of course the comeback they love even more. But I don't see Miriam Alsop as having had a fall off. If someone were to just ask me my opinion on Miriam Alsop, I would talk about a woman who did her best and moved on with her life when the pushback seemed to be more than the support.
Yeah. And again, being concerned about what preconceived notions are propped up by films like this. Now, take that idea of a maestra, a woman conductor getting a comeuppance. I mean, doesn't that add to an already difficult position that they're in?
Listen,
as a woman in the business.
Listen, Pavarotti, who we have talked about on this podcast in all of his problematic glory, is still very much performing around Italy. Okay, there are so
Pavarotti is dead. You're talking Placido Domingo.
Placido Domingo, my bad. Yep. There are so many true stories of people who deserve their comeuppance, or who deserve what's coming to them, whatever, that we don't talk about, but we have to just create a story around a very influential woman composer and put that out there. I'm not gonna, there's so many people who would say that they feel like I'm stretching for me to identify misogyny in a film that I haven't even seen. But just based on what I'm reading and based on what I'm understanding, I can't dismiss that aspect of it from this. This is not a movie about James Levine and all his bullshit. This is a movie that is drawing, according to the New York Times and many others, clear comparisons between a fictitious woman conductor and a real life woman conductor who has already gone through enough, and y'all gonna drag her across the coals some more. I think is unacceptable. But stepping back away just specifically from the subject matter, is this you talked about how much money we talked about. How much money do we have for the opera house? How much money and time do you have for a classical music film? I mean, there are a lot of movies out there, a lot of movies coming out. We about to have Wakanda Forever in the theaters. Am I really being expected to spend $20 to $25 plus $10 for a Coke, plus $15 for the popcorn, plus another $7 for the M&Ms on orchestral music? For goodness sake, I just don't see it. I don't see it for myself. It seems like really the only reason, this is hard for me to say because there are so many people who are impatiently waiting for my opinions on this film. I'll see it eventually. Offering opinions on the film at the end of the day would be the only reason I go to see it. And as jam-packed as my schedule is these days, again, you talk about how there's a lot of competition for the free time.
You got that right.
I don't know if this is winning the race. I mean, are you going to go out of your way to mask up and go to a movie theater to see this?
It's got Cate Blanchett, though. And I like Cate Blanchett.
So, as we were talking about last week, when it comes to the opera, casting is a significant part of it.
Yeah.
That seems to have done this for you. If this were a woman actor whose name you didn't know or who isn't famous, someone who just happens to be able to conduct with the story, the idea about a woman conductor and her downfall just based on the fact that this is about an orchestra and orchestral music, would that do it for you?
I will wait. In that instance, I would wait until it came out on HBO. But if it went to Showtime, I'm not paying for Showtime to watch.
Period. I mean, I happen to have Showtime, and that's
Oh, you
fine.
do?
But the point that I want to make is that there is an expectation for anyone who has ever had any proximity to orchestral music to be so grateful that the film industry is acknowledging and seeing us, that we'll go and run and see this film. And while I do, have some gratitude for orchestral music making it onto this platform, at least for the conversation, and maybe even to potentially grab some folks who are curious about the orchestral experience who haven't done it before and get them in a concert hall. I see all of that. It's not enough for me to see yet another predominantly white orchestra playing, music that doesn't represent a community that I belong to on stage. And just because it's a movie, I'm going to go see it. Now, watch me go see the movie and I love it and I think it's provocative and X, Y, Z, but just from the before seeing the film perspective, I'm not just running to the movie theater to catch this one, especially if I'm going to be supporting, what someone like Miran Alsop is, it's something that's creating a headache for her, as someone who from a distance, again, has appreciated the decisions and the motion she's tried to make. If this is an attempt to sully up her character, I'm extra uninterested.
Right. And that's a good point, because the article also mentions the fact that Alsop has been described in new accounts as a frontrunner to lead several major American orchestras, including some of the so-called Big Five. And it would be crappy if something like this film, I mean, I really feel like that's reaching. I feel like that might be going a little bit far, because I feel like the search committees would know.
There are so many, and I'm not going to say anyone's name, but there are so many conductors who I've talked to offline who say conducting ability just at the end of the day doesn't have a whole lot to do with who gets these jobs. And I can, and again, maybe I'm stretching now. We're both being conspiracy theorists today. It's not going to not impact the way some board members, especially some search committees,
you don't think so?
About hiring Miran Alsop for their orchestras. It's not going to be a non sequitur. Especially if people go back based on this movie and read the biography and identify, whatever things are pulled out of, and now they're running in their own minds with, again, all of this is conjecture. I haven't read the biography. I haven't seen the film. I just don't like the idea of one of the most influential woman conductors out here to be the subject of some bullshit, especially considering all the men who are still performing comfortably, who we need to be addressing and engaging. You said down in Argentina. Anyway, so yeah, I'll see it and I'm going to talk to y'all about it. But the first thing I'm seeing at the movie theater is Wakanda Forever. This is not going to be what the next time I get to go to the theater. This is not going to be it, and I will see it eventually and tell y'all all about it.
And you go ahead and get the popcorn. I'm laying off the concessions.
Because you got to bring them in your pocket. You see, you have to stop at Walgreens or the Dollar Tree before you get to the theater.
Bring a pocket of loose Raisinets.
Anyway, thoughts and prayers to everyone involved. I'll have links to both of these accidentals that we offered in the description. I did take a look, and it looks like there's some interesting music on the soundtrack of this film, Tar. There's some Gustav Mahler on the soundtrack. I think I saw that they put Elgar's cello concerto in it. That plays a role, a great piece of music. But there's also a number of works by composer Hildur Guðnadóttir. I think this is an Icelandic composer, and is offering, again, more of that contemporary aesthetic that I really appreciate out of orchestral music. We're talking about a woman composer who I always champion the underrepresented in this field, especially when it comes from the composer point of view. So shout out to Hildur Guðnadóttir. This is a little bit of the second movement of a work called Tar, as performed by the London Contemporary Orchestra. Music here from the soundtrack of the film Tar. to get us into our second movement. Were there any so-called classical films that really hit the mainstream outside of like the educational or that just genuinely got to the masses? I'm thinking about the film Amadeus. I didn't see that until maybe 2 years ago or something. I definitely wasn't there. I'm not sure if folks, really gave a damn about that outside of classical music. I'm thinking about the movie The Red Violin. Did you see that one?
I didn't.
See, I thought that was a little bit interesting. There's the film called The Piano, which isn't necessarily a classical music film, but I don't know. I think the concept of classical movies, classical music themed films, that's a stretch for for a lot of people anyway. There's the film, the only one that I could think about, and this is me using my perspective on the idea of classical music, the film Drumline, with Nick Cannon.
Mm-hmm.
That hit the culture and that hit the people, but that culture of music, that type of classical musicking is already so embedded in, Black culture, Southern culture, music education, all of those things. It really hit. This movie Tar just seems to be far removed from the perspective of folks who aren't orchestral musicians or like going to orchestra concerts or studied conducting or something like that. I'm just not sure if it works conceptually, classical music and film, at least considering the culture around classical music today.
We'll have to see what happens with that film Lenny on Leonard Bernstein, see if that hits. Did you ever see Brassed Off?
Mm-mm.
About miners in Britain in a brass band.
Somebody told me about that. Yeah, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I'm not thinking of anything. Immortal Beloved flopped. Yeah, I can't think of anything.
Well, maybe this is actually an interesting film, and I need to go give it the time and my $20 at AMC or whatever the movie theater is this week, but these days. But anyway, we're here in the second movement where Scott and I are going to share some music that we've been spending a little bit of time with and the role it's played in our lives, at least since the last time we recorded. So I'm going to go first and give a shout out to VJ Iyer. I interviewed him a couple weeks ago. That's interview is going to come up in a early January opus of TRILLOQUY, but he let me know that his jazz group was playing the Dakota, a venue here in Minneapolis. For folks who don't know. So, I immediately went to the website and bought a ticket and everything. Well, something happened and they weren't able to play the show. So instead, the McPhail Jazz Quintet performed. And again, for folks who don't know, the McPhail School of Music is a local music teaching institution. Someone recently told me it's the largest private music school for teens and developing musicians in the country. It's a big deal. I've given keynote speeches there. I've done some teaching for them. So anyway, they got the faculty quintet from this school to play the jazz club instead. And maybe it's just been a while since I've been to a jazz show, but I was really surprised at how standard the rep was, and not just standard, but all of the typical, what I would put in that sort of Beethoven 5 category of music, but on the jazz side. So we're talking about Somewhere Under the Sea. We're talking about Fly Me to the Moon. We're talking about Not in the Mood, but that's basically the only sort of standard that was not performed. But before I talk about the piece of music, though, that I want to highlight that was inspired by this performance, I wonder, in your jazz radio days, what the programming looked like when it comes to what is familiar to people, what's a standard versus what's adventurous or exploratory. How many times did you air In the Mood? But was that just in the rotation?
Not one time. most of the programming is taken care of by computers. You know, you would put everything in a hard drive and play from there.
Yeah.
You know, build your playlist that way. Well, at KVNO, when I was the jazz music director, we had a box, and there was heavy rotation, medium, light, and recurrent, or Jock's choice. And there was a method that we had that you would pull the CDs from. So I was constantly rotating in the new releases, and those are what we were really focusing on. Josh Redman, Al Di Meola, things like that.
Do you feel like the jazz audience that you were, you know, doing this curation for appreciated the more new release? Well, would you say that was your experience with this audience, or did you get the phone calls or emails about, no, we want more recognizable things or things that we can sing along to?
There were a few specialist hosts that we had early in the evening that did that sort of thing. Shout out to Bill Watts, host of Primetime Jazz, the late Bill Watts, had a story about everything, you know, because he was a big jazz head, and he would spin 4 hours of gold and tell amazing stories.
Based on standard rep, though, you're saying.
Yeah, by the, you know, the old stuff. But if you were listening late in the evening and overnight, you would hear maybe 25 minutes out of the hour would be new releases. 10 to 15 minutes would be your recurrent and medium rotation, and maybe 5 to 10 minutes out of the hour would be something from history.
Okay, well, again, I'm asking all of these questions because maybe the jazz audiences do want to hear a whole concert of things that they know, but I was not prepared for that. I thought I was, anyway, that is not a dig. That is just my honest reaction to this concert I went to. So by the end of the show, I'm like, okay, well, I mean, this was a nice night out. I'm not going to complain, but I thought I was going to, you know, really hear something experimental or exploratory. That's just the kind of listener I am. But, you know, they flipped my whole mood of this quintet by ending with an arrangement of an Anita Baker track called Sweet Love. I don't know if you spent much time with Anita Baker in your day. You know, Anita Baker was the road trip music of my family growing up. My dad liked to drive. My dad worked overnight, so it was just easier for him to drive overnight. If we have a 12-hour trip somewhere, plus the kids, you know, we could just go to sleep and not bother him. So to help facilitate that, my mom used to play a lot of Anita Baker. So when I hear this jazz quintet closing with an arrangement of Sweet Love, not only am I thinking about my childhood, but I'm thinking about how this is a great example of a standard that maybe a lot of people wouldn't know, but should know. So if I think that if we're going to talk about curation and digging into things that audiences might know, we have to go beyond just, you know, what's in the real book or what's in, you know, the standard jazz programming for a space. I know because of the type of listener I am, you know, I may be separate from the person who rightfully so wants to go to a jazz club and hear something they know. So, you know, I'm still working on how I think about that, but I don't know. I prefer a live concert experience to be an experience that's different than what I can get on Spotify on my way to the venue.
Right, but isn't it the case in university settings they have classes that specialize? I mean, isn't there like one band that does that sort of thing, and then there's another band that does the avant-garde? I mean, isn't that?
I mean, that's why I'm asking the questions. I didn't major in jazz, so I don't know what they're doing. But anyway, so thinking about the Anita Baker track, Sweet Love, of course, listening and enjoying the original, thinking about the arrangement that I saw at the Dakota as performed by the McPhail Jazz Quintet, going down a rabbit hole and found an arrangement for solo acoustic guitar by Kent Nishimura that I've enjoyed, and I want to share a little bit of a little bit with y'all today. So here's his take on Anita Baker's Sweet Love. Nice, smooth take on an R&B classic.
What's his name?
Kent Nishimura.
Man, he is doing some stretching with that left hand.
Yeah, I was noticing that. I do, there's always a little dust in the corners. I'm not a guitarist, not me critiquing guitar performances, but I do wish there was a little bit more. If I were listening to a piano, I would say the right hand. So I guess with guitar, I'm saying that high E string, the melody, but at the same time, the fact that he's creating like a rhythm section on his own and doing this, I think it's really cool. Again, just as we were talking about with that piano arrangement of the Rick Ross, this is another great example of how we can set a benchmark, normalize this sort of approach to acoustic guitar in classical spaces so that we're, broadening our audiences and helping more people be seen, and honestly, platforming a really cool track.
Yeah.
So something that's nice to listen to. All of the solo guitar etudes and sonatas by Scarlatti and all of those people, they're just lovely. I think it's great to have this platformed as well. I think if there are jazz ensembles that are taking these more contemporary R&B, and I'm using that word contemporary, but Sweet Love has been a song probably for 30 years now, longer.
I was playing that in my DJ days.
Yeah. It's great music that I think can help bridge that gap and be a benchmark into reframing classical music, even reframing jazz, because I'm sure that there's some very straight ahead jazz ensembles that wouldn't go into the 80s and 90s R&B, but
sure.
The group I saw at the Dakota did. So while I didn't love the very, 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 very standard set, I am more of a new music listener, an exploratory, discovery based music listener. I can affirm that and also celebrate the platforming of this really great classic tune by Anita Baker. So be sure to go check out Kent Nishimura's take on it. I'll have a link in the description.
You're a fan of Anita Baker, or at least you know the catalog from road trips.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard her sing "You Belong to Me"?
Oh, of course.
Whew.
Of course.
Whew.
And, she recently got the rights to all of her music, the publishing to her music. It's something how you can be such a famous person
and not have any
and
money.
not even have the rights to your own songs, to your own stuff. So shout out to Anita Baker for that as well. All right, what you got this week?
Need to give a rest in peace to Mimi Parker, who died just yesterday, 55 years old, ovarian cancer. Screw cancer. Let's get that out of the way. Mimi Parker was married to Alan Sparhawk. They're both Duluth residents. And in 1993, they formed a band called Low. Very successful all around the state and across the country. They have a big following. The two of them are married. Did I mention that? They are married. And, excuse me, they have a sound that if you have to put it somewhere, minimalist or slowcore, and that's another name that you slap on somebody and then they don't like it. Yeah, Alan was never a very big fan of it. But the idea of it seemed to be to create a lot of space in their music. The songs go on for a long time. The tempo is slow. The reverb is all the way up. Sometimes some digital delay in there. And I always respected them for the fact that they, it's interesting. We're talking about human contact and human aspect of things. I think that they just really connected with one another and were able to stay in the moment, to keep the tempo the way that it was and not rush it. And, and if you hit a clam note, when you got the reverb all the way up and a delay on, you're going to know. People are going to
who's to say it's a clam?
It's going to be obvious.
That maybe that's how they wanted it to sound.
But I think just the tight connection that they had as collaborators, like communing, it's they maybe even going into a trance together. But I wanted to bring in the Low track that really features Mimi. She's a drummer and the vocalist, one of the vocalists for the band. This is when I caught on to him in 2013, and it's much more of an alternative pop track. It's not the slowcore sound. It's called from the 2013 album The Invisible Way. This is Just Make It Stop.
If I could just make it stop, I could tell the whole world to get out of the way. If I could just make it stop, if I could just make it stop, breaking my heart, get out of the way. If I could just make it stop.
Talking about the human aspect of things, of communing. It was really interesting to listen to the music and look a little bit at social media and know that there were thousands of people across the state who were all doing the same thing. They were listening to the music and telling stories and remembering. And I think that that's something very beautiful to inspire. And I hope that Alan knows that the state is here supporting. And I appreciate the fact that you could see them at a big arena style or outdoor style show. Like just 2 months ago was their last performance live together up in Duluth. Or one afternoon you might catch them in the record store at Electric Fetus with 6 other people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they were in the community. They were, you know, your friendly neighborhood musician.
Yeah. Well, death is just as temporary as life. And, you know, thanks to the causes that Mimi Parker put out into the world and recording all of this music, she has a legacy that will move on and live on forever. I'm learning about her now, but now I get to learn about her, and we get to spread, you know, her legacy to so many people. It's just, you know, when it comes to death, I always try to be positive because we have the opportunity to celebrate them. You know, they can't celebrate themselves anymore. They don't have the life to do that. So here we are to do that on their behalf.
Yeah.
And all in the, as you're saying, all in the name of human connection and the human experience. So yeah, rest in power to Mimi Parker, and long live the music of Low. Really great to share that here, especially with the local connection. I think that's always great. Again, speaking about community, as we were talking about in the very beginning of this. All right, well, we're going into the third movement. The guest this week is Elijah Daniel Smith. Elijah is a composer who is, you know, really hitting his stride out here. He's the commission recipient, the latest commission recipient from the American Composers Orchestra. Got to work and collaborate with him back in June in New York City. He offers a really important perspective on the diversity of Blackness, Black music, and the Black experience as a composer that I think is very, very important. Not everybody that's Black and writing music is writing jazz or is writing blues and or hip hop. There's a lot of different things happening out there, and Elijah does a great job of making that point. And you know, I also talk about the fact again that his work has come up on TRILLOQUY and some of his stories. And, you know, it was a good lesson for me to have to actually face someone who, you know, I may have said a thing or two about. I think we have a great relationship now. It's been phenomenal to get to hang out with Elijah and get to know him better. But I think that's something I needed. So, you know, when it comes to talking about living composers, especially, I now pretend that I'm going to see them tomorrow. And if I said what I said, I said what I said. And it's great to get that human connection and that human experience. So we do talk about a bit of that. I can't remember if that's going to pop up on on round one this week. This is going to be a two-part interview. But what does come up is Elijah's origins in music and as a composer. A lot of composers, started taking piano or violin lessons when they were little kids, or came up through orchestras or wind ensembles. Well, Elijah came up not only through the guitar, but the guitar as it relates to some of these rock bands and metal bands. So he gets into that as his catalyst into composition a little later in this interview. And he cites a band that I had never heard of. They're called Trivium. Have you ever heard of Trivium?
Not one time.
He talks a little bit about how Trivium was at the beginnings of his journey as a musician. So to transition into the third movement and into my conversation with Elijah Daniel Smith, we're going to listen to a little bit of a Trivium tune called Until the World Goes Cold. The world is going cold here in Minnesota.
As we
for
speak.
sure. I have the heavy sweater on today.
That's
so
right.
So shout out to Elijah Daniel Smith. Hope y'all enjoyed this conversation. Here's a bit of Until the World Goes Cold by Trivium to get us into the third movement.
It's definitely been kind of surreal getting a little more recognition for things. I think it's one of the, like, going back 5-6 years when I was in my undergrad and stuff like that, it felt like, the point that I'm at right now is a long way away. So it definitely feels pretty abnormal for it to be kind of right here right now. And it's really gratifying, but it still feels a little surreal, and like I don't really know what's happening most of the time.
When you think back, 5 to 6 years, do you see or do you think back to that time as being filled with all of these different composers and I have to reach my way to the top? Or I mean, that's definitely how it is from the instrumental side. We're in these I'm in a bassoon studio and I'm like, okay, if all of us show up to the audition, it's just going to be one of us. So there's always that bit of competition that's in there. Is it similar from the composer side of things?
I think so. I mean, I think just because of the nature of it, like you're saying, a lot of these calls for scores and things like that, there is one winner. And so I think the nature of it, or sometimes there's more than one, you know what I mean? I think the nature of it breeds competition. But at least in my experience, the composers that really focus on that competitive aspect of it are usually the ones to avoid socially, just because there's already enough competition in this world, and it's already tough enough when you get those rejections. And the way I've always sort of seen it is that, yeah, I would much rather be friends with all these people. So if they win something that I don't, I can be happy for them. So it's just like, it's, I think there's definitely that element of like having to beat everyone else out and you got to be at the top. But I find that to be probably the least enjoyable part of this, and the mindset and mentality that I try to avoid the most.
Do you see yourself as having the level of privilege to be completely woo-woo about composition? Oh, this is what's in my heart and I'm writing it down on paper. Or is there a considerable consideration for, okay, I gotta pay the bills, I gotta do X, Y, and Z? How do you balance those two things?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, I'm not going to try to present it as anything that's not. Like, I definitely come from a privileged point of view in all of this, not least of all my upbringing, but also because I'm in a PhD program that has a stipend right now. So it's like, there is that big consideration that I have been afforded an opportunity that a lot of people would kill for. And it would be dishonest of me to characterize it as anything else but that. But on top of that, I find, I have a real mixed sort of relationship with people who are like, I write because I have to, not because I want to. And I've always kind of felt I've always seen it as like, we write music because we get to. And there are a lot of people that would love to do this, but can't for various reasons. Either they never had the opportunity, they don't have the means, or they don't have the time because they're working 3 jobs to get by and they don't have time to write music. So I've always felt that it is a privilege for me to get to do this, and it will never be anything other than that. It can be a frustrating privilege at times, but I would rather have a frustrating privilege than not have that. So I mean, it would be very short-sighted and narrow-minded of me to be like, oh, it's just in my heart and it's all I can do. It's like
Yeah.
I get to do this, and I'm fortunate to get to do it.
Yeah, I was talking with Shelley Washington a little while ago, someone who I know that you know. We were talking about the difference between the human being and the brand that kind of gets out there. Do you see a difference between Elijah, the person who all of your friends know and hang out with, and Elijah Daniel Smith, who, we see these headshots, we see this list of compositions. Are you having to change the way you move as this privilege manifests more and more?
I mean, I don't think so. And even if that was becoming a thing, I think I'd definitely try not to. But it's funny you say that because like just yesterday, there's a video from a saxophonist that I've worked with named Julian Velasco. And he used, he said Elijah Daniel Smith, and I put it on Instagram. And one of my friends that I've known since high school, sent me a message, and she was like, "It was really weird hearing your full government name in this context." And so, like, I think there's probably an element of that for people who have known me for a long time to see this whole like, oh look, like headshots and all this stuff. But for me, I kind of feel as though I don't feel as though I have a different brand for my personality. I think I'm a pretty straightforward person. And I think that's the same in my music and the
Yep.
same in the way I present myself to people. I try not to be anything other than what I naturally am, for better or for worse.
Yeah. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that you have come up on the TRILLOQUY podcast before. And, when it's like, again, the world gets so small, the deeper you get into this music, folks that I read about or, talk about on the show end up being folks that, I meet. When we met in person for the first time, I was like, oh gosh, I wonder if he listens to TRILLOQUY. And so we had that conversation. So let's revisit that quickly. Basically, my idea was, so this was in conjunction, first of all, with a project you had with the Chicago Symphony. And I was like, okay, well, here's this guy, this composer using all these big words that people don't understand and X, Y, and Z. Maybe I would have pulled back a little bit if we had that personal relationship, but I don't know. I think there's something to that. I wonder if you've had time to think about those words from the TRILLOQUY podcast, the idea that we have to speak directly to audiences and not over their heads.
Yeah. I mean, when I remember listening to that podcast, and as soon as, you're like bit, contradictory, bit hypocritical, and I was like, shit. And I was like, he's fucking right. And so like I think looking back in the program note that I wrote, I'm not entirely sure what I would have said differently. Not that I wouldn't have said anything differently, but I think I personally despise writing program notes to begin with. And so like I had a lot of difficulty with that one because I was thinking about these, big word topics when I was writing that piece. And so I felt like, when writing that program note, it was kind of like, what do I say? Like, do I just be honest about what I was thinking about when I wrote this piece, or do I try to present this thing as something that it's not for the sake of being more accessible? And I went in the direction of like, I'm just going to say what I had in my head when I was writing it. And you're absolutely right. I don't think that thought process is accessible to a lot of people. And so looking back on it, there was probably a way to find a happy medium in between those two and find a way to present these things. But I think it's important to hear that kind of criticism, because all of us are going to make mistakes. All of us are going to believe things and then sometimes not live up to the things that we believe in for a variety of reasons. So I think it was it was important to, it was an important learning experience at the very least, to know that like these two, like, you know, I think this, and then all of a sudden people are like, you're not doing that though, so
Hmm.
figure that shit out.
Well, and for what it's worth, it was definitely a learning experience for me as well. At this point, I pretend that everyone I talk about, I'm going to meet one day. So,
Fair
and
enough.
that doesn't change, you know, the way I address some things or some people. But I want to pull on this thread for a little while of program notes.
Mm,
I don't advertise it a lot, but I write my fair share of program notes for artists and for presenters who just don't want to do it. So I understand how much of a lift that is. At the same time, there are so many folks who need those program notes. And in my
mm,
work as a radio producer, I need to have something to sell this piece of music to the audience with, especially when we're talking about new music. I can make up a story about Beethoven, but you know, if I have a work of yours on my playlist and I can't find any program notes, now I just have to make something up. You know, are
yeah.
program notes something that you see as an important part of the delivery and presentation of your music?
Um, Man, I don't know about my music in particular. I think, again, I think it's really difficult for me to be an accurate judge of anything regarding my own music, because to me it's
Mm,
straightforward because I wrote it, but then other people might hear it and be like, you absolutely need to explain that, because why would anyone else understand what you're thinking there? But I think in general, I do think there is an importance on, you know, program notes are important for audience members, and my um distaste for program notes isn't with them as a concept, it's with the way they're executed most of the time, because I
hmm,
think that, you know, there are multiple types of program notes. There are program notes that are clearly written for, you know, the audience to help bring them in, and then oftentimes in much more in academic environments and stuff, but there are program notes that's just full of like the biggest words that the composer could find and self-aggrandizing bullshit the whole time. And it's just like there comes a certain point in time where I'm kind of like, that doesn't tell me anything, and it feels
yeah.
like they're, you know, program notes are kind of like patting ourselves on the back. um and so I think I have a difficult time personally writing program notes that I feel um are honest to what the piece is, and actually can still bring the audience into it. Um, so I don't know if that really answers the question, but I do think they're important, but I have a hard time with them.
Yeah, and I understand because I've talked with a number of composers who sort of see the possibility, not necessarily I'll say, but the possibility of program notes being a means of policing the audience into
Mm.
reacting to the music in a certain way or understanding the music from a certain perspective. I mean, do you you write many different types of pieces of music, but I guess I'll ask, is it required for an audience member when it comes to most of your music to have background, or do you feel like you write the type of music that someone can just take in and evaluate and experience in their own way?
Mm. I want to write that kind of music. Whether or not it actually is that way, is a different story. I think,
Hmm.
you know, I have a lot of pieces that are like pretty aggressive right out of the gate. And I think in times like that, it probably is a little helpful to have something for an audience member to look at and say, like, oh, okay, now I understand why this is so, you know, gung ho. But at the same time, I think uh it can be misleading sometimes, for me to say like, oh, this is what I was thinking about, and this is what I want you to think, because I think sometimes that can negatively impact the
Hmm.
listener's experience, especially if they don't hear what it is that I'm talking about. So, and you know, like I think there are a lot of, I haven't done this yet, but I know that there are a lot of composers who will name their like piece after it's written, and then they'll come up with a whole like bullshit backstory about like what the name means and then everything. And like audience members are sitting there like, oh, I could totally hear that. And it's like, so like, you know, I think I want to avoid that, but I always have that in the back of my head. I'm like, am I like telling some bullshit story about this right now that has nothing to do with this piece? Like, I don't know.
So are you saying that you come up with titles first and then write the piece?
I usually have like an idea, but like, you know, obviously when I'm starting the piece, and then I find a name for it midway through is usually what happens. There are a couple pieces where it's like I know what it's about, but I haven't found a name for it yet, and then I'll find a good name for it afterwards. But at least it's still inspired by what, you know, inspired the piece. But hopefully I won't get to a point where I just come up with some like nonsensical name for a piece and like, oh, it means this.
Yeah, I
So
mean, because I think the other side of that spectrum is naming concert piece number 1, string quartet number 5,
Yeah.
you know, and just do it. But why is that not your approach? Just the plain Jane, all right, this is a piece.
Yeah. I don't know. I find that like those terms, at least for me, like as awful as this, and maybe it's not doesn't sound awful, but like I think there's definitely something to be said about a good title makes you want to listen to a piece a little more.
Mm,
And it can also make it a little more memorable. There are a lot of great pieces out there that I love that are like string quartet number 2 or something like that. And it's a good piece, but there comes a point in time where I think like even having conversations with like my musician friends, there comes a point where I notice like we're just throwing out like fucking names and numbers, like not even like piece titles, like, oh, this person number 7. And it's like,
yeah.
what are you talking about? So I think that sometimes having piece titles can make it a little more, not I'm not going to say approachable for someone, but it can make it a little more memorable. And for someone who might have only heard this piece once, I think sometimes having a piece title can help them remember, like, oh yeah, I do remember that piece. I don't remember what Bruckner 7 sounds like, but I do remember this other piece that has a more interesting name and something more memorable. So
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know.
You're making me think of the composer Joy Goodry. I don't know if you know
Yeah.
Joy, but Joy has a piece out there called "Shut the Fuck Up and Listen," and I was like, oh, okay, so this is something I need to hear, you know. So I
Yeah.
definitely hear you when it comes to a title, being able to engage
Yeah.
or create some curiosity.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the case for most composers is um, some sort of instrument or some performance something was the
Mm.
impetus, what was the means to composition. Was that the case for you?
Um, kind of. Mine was like really roundabout. I first started taking music really seriously when I was about 10. My older sister showed me this metal band called Trivium. And the first time I heard them, that was the first time that I was like, I want to play music. And I wanted to, play guitar and scream in a metal band. And I did for a while. And then I ended up accidentally enrolling in a classical voice program for performing arts high school. I didn't realize it was
Accidentally?
classical. Yeah, I didn't realize it was classical until I got there. And day one, I was like, oh shit. And like I couldn't read music or anything really. So I was like, this is gonna be a real tough time. But I think around my junior year, the band that I was playing in split up, and I figured I'm at the school studying classical voice, and I think I realized that I actually really liked classical music. So for a while, I did really want to go down the route of being a classical singer, and I did that for a year in college. I went to University of Illinois for voice for a year, and like very quickly realized that wasn't actually what I wanted to do. And so it was pretty early on that I realized that I wanted to write music instead. And I was spending most of my time doing that anyway, instead of practicing, much to my teacher's dismay. And so I kind of came into it like a lot of us do in college through some sort of performance, but at least for me, I think somehow my desire to write music was on a slightly different thing than singing, because maybe it was just that I still kept writing music in some sort after I stopped playing in bands, and it naturally progressed into writing notated music because that's what I was studying. But yeah, so I mean, I guess through some sort of performance practice, I got into it, but I think they kind of came from slightly different musical experiences.
What instrument did you play in the band that you were with?
I played guitar and screamed in a metal band in high school.
Was
So yeah.
playing so-called classical guitar never of interest? That was never an option in your mind?
Yeah, I don't know why. Like my first guitar teacher was like a classical guitarist, and I just wasn't into it. Like I kind of like I just didn't give a shit. I was like, dude, I want to like turn the amp up to 11 and shred, bro. Like I don't care about these So like I like and like he was. I think maybe it was just again some stubbornness because I was like 12 and didn't really have the patience to really get into something that required that I learned how to read music and stuff like that. But yeah, it was never really on my radar or something that I was really interested in.
That's interesting because it was pretty early in my development that I saw electric guitarists shredding, as you say, but with the third movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata and that sort of
Yeah.
stuff. I mean, I don't know, it's interesting for me to hear your perspective from the band, and not concert band as many of
Yeah.
us come through, but just straight up band. Do you spend much time with that music these days, even if just in your free time?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I try really hard to not only make one type of music because I just find that to be like it gets a little monotonous, and I think ideas coming from other types of music make all of them more interesting. So like, I have some like sort of indie rock music out there. I do a lot of stuff with like modular synthesizers and stuff like that. And so I think it's all still there. I haven't played metal in probably 10 years. It's not that I don't like that music anymore. I think it's just that a lot of that teen angst that I had that was really fueling that desire, thankfully isn't here anymore. So like
Hmm.
I don't have as much of a desire to scream my head off into a microphone anymore as I did when I was 16. But
So is the electric guitar screamo concerto too obvious? Is that something that you've worked on or have something have in one of your back drawers or something?
No, somehow it's not. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely an idea. If someone commissions me to write that, I might try my best. But no, it's not. It's not. It's not in my head right now. But there are things that I think are definitely do show up more subtly in my music. Like I got a saxophone quartet that's just as loud as humanly possible, right? Right from the start, and that I think, it definitely comes from my affinity for loud, aggressive sounds. And the piece that I wrote for the CSO, the percussion part was pretty heavily influenced by metal drumming and blast beats and stuff like that. So it's like these things I think do show up in my music, but not in a really obvious way sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. We'll return to there's something I want to return to here in a bit, but I do want to talk about sort of survival creativity. You talk about listening to many different types of music and how that plays a role. You know, we artists, we also have to do a various array of jobs and yeah, there's creativity in just surviving as an artist, including working outside of the field. We
Mm.
both discovered that we are bartending alum. That's something that we've done, stood behind the bars with degrees in music. I think it's
Yeah.
interesting to think about the guy or the girl, the individual who graduates with an engineering degree, goes straight into a job and their career takes off. That's not the case for folks
Yeah.
like us. How have you engaged working outside of the field as you develop as you
Mm.
have developed as an artist?
Yeah. I mean, I was a bartender for a little while in between my undergrad and my master's. And it's funny, like in my undergrad, I wanted to do film scores and I went out to LA to do all that sort of stuff and realized pretty quickly it wasn't for me. And I think after making that realization, I kind of just distanced myself from that world, and rather than push myself to do something that I really hated, I figured it would be more fun to just bartending for a little bit.
Yeah.
And it was something that does it, like mixology and all this sort of stuff does really interest me. I think it's fascinating. But at the time, and maybe this is just like naivety or maybe a little bit of arrogance, I felt as though it was temporary. And that made me feel a little bit better about doing it, because it was kind of like, it was, to me at the time, it was one of those things where it's like, I'm doing this until I can go back and get my master's.
Hmm.
And I was lucky enough to get into a master's program. Otherwise, that mentality probably wouldn't have stayed around much longer if I wasn't, if I didn't have a pretty clear end in sight. But I think it was, it's definitely one of those moments where it's like you see these people coming into these bars who are barely older than you, who are clearly making three times as much as you are. And there were times where, of course, I thought to myself, like, do I even want to keep doing, this whole composer thing? Like, is this going to be the most fulfilling thing for me? But I think I realized that I hated being in the film scoring industry so much, despite the potential for making a lot of money, that I realized that I I want to do what I want to do, even if I don't make a whole lot of money. And I've kind of known that for a while, that I won't be happy if I'm slogging away at a desk job all day for
Hmm.
90K a year, if it means that I go home every night and I'm like, God damn it, I have to wake up and do this shit again tomorrow. So like,
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe, again, maybe that mentality won't last, but we'll see.
What was it about film scoring that you didn't vibe with?
Mm. Oof. I felt as though it was, and this won't come as a shock to anyone, the film industry in general, I felt was pretty exploitative. And there was a reliance on young people who were willing to say yes to do a lot of things for a lot less than what they should have been given, because it is so hyper competitive, that there's always that thought in the back of your head that, like, whoever's hiring someone for these jobs, there's very much that mentality a lot of the time, not all the time, but there's often that mentality of like, if this person says no, there are 40 people lined up right behind them ready to do it in their place, and probably for less. So I think there's something about, you know, feeling like I, I wanted to write music, and I enjoyed interacting with musicians and all these people for so long because I felt as though it was a fairly honest group of people, and people who maybe valued each other a little bit more as professional colleagues because it is a different experience. And then getting out to LA and realizing that wasn't at all the case. And it was just like, can you do this for as little as possible? Yes, great, go do it until you're tired of it, and then we'll find somebody else. And there's something about that it just sucked all of the joy and fun out of music making for me. And I'm sure that other people have had very different experiences. That was my experience. And, it was very much not the thing that I thought it was going into it.
Yeah, that word exploitative is a very powerful word, especially considering how most composers get on. It's through, X fellowship or X reading or those sorts of things. How do you
Yeah.
determine what isn't exploitative as you've traversed these things?
Yeah. I mean, for new music, I think one of the things that prevents it from being exploitative for me is the fact that there isn't nearly as much money in this for people to really exploit out of each other. But I think there are definitely things out there where it definitely see, like, in retrospect, that I've done, like, there are all these summer programs for composers where you pay a shit ton of money to go hear someone play your piece, and they've rehearsed it for 2 days, and you're like, okay. And so I think there are experiences like that where, from one, on one hand, it's like it is a helpful experience for young composers to do these things if they have the means available to them to go hear their pieces played by professional organizations or ensembles and get feedback from them and all these sorts of things. But at the same time, there is definitely an element in those circumstances where it's like, it's not ideal. And that's not all summer festivals or programs at all. And there are some that are great, and there are some that, like, you do have to pay for, but you still get a lot out of it. But there are definitely some out there where it's just like you pay a lot and you get very little back. And I think that's the first thing that comes to mind when I think about exploitation in new music, recognizing that there are some younger composers, especially composers who come from families with more means. Some people realize, like, yeah, they'll pay $3,000 to come do this, and they put as little effort into it as possible, and they walk away with a shit ton of money. So you know, I think that's probably always maybe not always going to be the case, but it's been the case for a while. And I think so long as there are young composers out there who recognize they need to hear their music played and they have the money to spend on that, they will probably do so.
Yeah, I want to underscore that for those of us who don't have that composer perspective and never
Yes,
see
thank you.
that side of the industry. I mean, I'll just ask again, you pay, or it's a norm for composers to pay to get their pieces read? That's just a thing?
Yeah. I mean, it's really common for summer festivals. Like, you've got, like, your big summer festivals for instrumentalists. You've got your Tangolas and your Brewards and things like
Right.
that, where you pay to go play. Pay to play. And for composers, it's the same idea, except that you're just paying to have someone play your music on the other side. And I think the thing that's slightly different for composers is that, in a lot of, for an instrumentalist, you're spending a lot of your time in lessons, in rehearsals, all these different things, and your schedule is often, like, pretty fleshed out. But for composers, a lot of the time there just isn't that. There's a lot of downtime in these festivals, and having I went to Brevard as a vocalist in high school, and, like, our schedules are packed, and there's a lot for us to do, and there's a lot for us to get out of it, and it was a very educational experience. But then seeing the flip side of that as a composer, there were days where, like, I didn't have anything scheduled, and it's like, I paid how much money to do this thing, and I have, like, 6 things over 10 days, and it's kind of like, what is the big payoff here? And I think at the end of the day, the big payoff is you get to put it on your resume, you might get a decent recording out of it, and hopefully, if you're working with good musicians, you'll learn a lot through that experience. But then on the flip side, there are summer festivals out there that are pay to play that are really good, and they do actually give you some, like, fleshed out things. But there's definitely a price point there, and I think that alone tailors this industry towards people with financial means. Because if
So
you don't have that money, you can't do that.
so what justifies in the mind of a composer paying the $3, 4, $5,000 to have one of these opportunities to get a piece of music read? Is it the hope that someone in the audience, is a general manager of an orchestra and they'll commission me, or what's the hope for outcome?
I mean, that's the hope. But obviously, most of us know that that's never going to happen. I think the biggest for me when I did those festivals, to be perfectly honest, I did them as resume boosters because I knew that I wanted to apply to PhD programs and I needed to have some more stuff under my belt going into that process. So for me, it served a very utilitarian purpose. And it was part of what helped me get into these programs, maybe not. But it definitely isn't, it's not an immediate gratification sort of thing. And it's not sort of like a, direct in and out, sort of equation. It's kind of like this will be maybe a little sweetener on the page if someone's looking at it and wondering if I have enough experience to survive and, actually do things in this environment. So,
Hmm.
And again, like that also speaks to like a lot of these academic programs where it's just like if they're looking for things like that on the resumes of applicants, then they're immediately weeding out a lot of people who might not have had the financial means to do these things. And there's an element of, sometimes inadvertent and sometimes maybe deliberate classism on these programs to say like we don't want people who haven't done these things, but maybe they don't realize that means that they're excluding an entire portion of the population who might not have had the opportunity but would be great for their program. So,
and I think that makes programs like Earshot from the American Composers Orchestra so important because there aren't application fees and,
absolutely.
ACO pays for travel and that sort of thing. That while what you're saying just contextualizes the importance of those sorts of programs for me to an even greater degree. With the finances considered and aside, I wonder why things like American Composers Orchestra Earshot, why you consider that important or
Yeah.
maybe even vital.
Yeah. I mean, firstly, as you said, like it's all expenses paid, and that's very rare.
Hmm.
And again, like there are a lot of, pay to play programs out there that are very much worth your time, but there are some that aren't. But thankfully, I think programs like ACO, a lot of younger composers who might not have had an opportunity to have their orchestra music played. Maybe the university they go to doesn't have, an avenue for that to happen, and they'd have to try to put together their own ragtag orchestra, which is, a lot of work. I think it's really important to have that opportunity for us to be able to say, like, yeah, I get to go be around professional musicians in an orchestra who are going to give me direct feedback. And I know that it's not just so this organization can get paid by us. This is genuinely to foster, orchestral experience in younger composers. So I think those are really important for us as composers, obviously, but I think it's also important for the industry in general. I don't even know if I would use the word industry for new music community, whatever you want to call it. But I think it's important because it gives younger composers an opportunity to, I don't want to say take risks, but learn about learn about the experience of working with an ensemble that size, to see what risk taking even looks like on that level, to see what it would even be like to say like, yeah, I want to try this new thing. Is that even possible right here? And if it is, how do I go about doing that? So it gives a practical knowledge to composing that I think is oftentimes a little elusive for younger composers.
A little bit there of a work called Ice and Obsidian by Elijah Daniel Smith. So grateful to have him on the show and to share part 1 of the conversation that I had with him. Looking forward to sharing part 2 with y'all next week. What do you think about the aesthetic that Elijah created in that piece? We don't hear the electric guitar in that context within a classical context very often at all. That's something that would really grab my ear and make me lean a little bit closer onto the stage at the performer or to the recording that's being aired or shared wherever. I think it's really great, and I think it's generally an aesthetic that classical spaces need to lean more into, because it is classical through an American context, through American experiences, and something that is really quite beautiful at the end of the day.
That piece that you just played is more in line with what Lowe is known for.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that style of music is more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And people say, "Oh, I can do that."
Oh, well,
I
then,
can,
okay, you can do that. Well, why didn't you then?
Yeah.
That's always my response. Why didn't you then?
To do it and make it sound artistic, and to make it musical, that's difficult.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing I wanted to ask you, before we get into the fourth movement, we have these living composers out here, and we close with Elijah talking about the way that service organizations like American Composers Orchestra and other folks really just help living composers. I see the need and I see the gratitude when I meet these composers and they get to see their works performed by these ensembles and they get these recordings created. And it's just, it fills and warms my heart to be able to make actual human impact. Again, we're talking about human connection. I really love it. And I love that I get to do that, as a part of my living, just supporting composers who are out here trying to make it. You've been talking about composers in a general sense for over 30 years now. I wonder if your perspective on composers has shifted as you've had more proximity with living composers, even being a part of commissioning them and getting them on in some way.
Yeah, they're people too. Obviously, I can't speak to any from the canon that are dead and gone, but you read profiles on them, or you can read their correspondence and get a vibe for what they were like. But I think the veneer of that composer on a pedestal dropped away really quickly when they answered the Zoom call in a T-shirt that looked just like mine. That they probably slept in it.
Yeah, yeah.
Me too. Because it was COVID time or something like that. But the composers of today that I have spoken with so far, they're just like your neighbor.
Yeah.
They're not, the ones that I have run into are not putting on any airs. They're trying to make their bills just like everybody else. They put their pants on one leg at a time, all that. Yeah.
And I think just being able to have that connection makes the stories that you tell about the music that much more personal. Sure. And that much more relatable, that much more interesting. Again, we continue, always to circle this conversation. Well, are we throwing away the canon? Is it a both and sort of conversation? And, am I being reasonable? I will say, fine, it's a both and. We mix in the living composers with some of the more historical composers, but just seeing the positive impact that just platforming and affirming living composers has on my fellow human being, it's hard for me to justify spending 20-25 minutes airing, performing, rehearsing, whatever, a piece of music by a composer who is long dead, who's not going to be at the performance, and that space that we could be given to someone who's here and alive.
Right.
And not only just the moral support, but helping them pay their bills, helping them eat. So that's where I'm always coming from. I hope more folks will give more room to the idea of centering, not just including, but centering living composers, because it certainly transformed the way that I engage music. I talk a lot these days. People know me as the person who, affirms Blackness through music, Black performers, Black aesthetics, all of that stuff. But it really did begin when I was getting started in radio with living composers. Right. I just learned all of these names of people who are alive that I did not know. Of course, along those lines, along the way, I'm learning the names of women composers who I don't know who are alive, Black composers, other composers of color. So I think if we can just, again, this through line theme this week of a human connection, if we can just see the humanity behind some of this music, especially for living composers, we can create arguments for it and arguments why we should leave more of the so-called canon behind, just so that we can make sure that we're doing what we can for folks who are here and now. So again, shout out and congratulations to Elijah Daniel Smith. Looking forward to sharing part 2 of our conversation with y'all next week. But it's time for us to get into the Triloquy, and we're going to do it with a little music by George Gershwin. We're talking about growth. We're talking about building bridges. And I have really been leaning into reconsidering the music of George Gershwin, especially some of his orchestral work. So we're going to get into the fourth movement this week with a little bit the ending here of a work of his known as Catfish Row, the Porgy and Bess Suite, brought to you by the Gewandhaus Orchestra of Leipzig, led by Ricardo Chailly. Here's a little bit of that. What I had to really dig into and realize to open up my heart and my spirit to the music of George Gershwin is acknowledging the hurt and the trauma and the frustration that may be inappropriately pointed at folks like Gershwin. It's frustrating for me to think about the fact that we learn about Black orchestral aesthetics of music through this composer before we talk about Margaret Bonds and Florence Price and William Grant Still and James Johnson and all of those folks. So, it's not about George Gershwin taking someone else's place because he made his own spot in history. I think that the way history, especially music history, is contextualized, it leaves room for people to, like me, to respond to the trauma and to the hurt of a situation and point that toward, someone who did not create that system or perpetuate that system. I mentioned that just sort of as the framing and the introduction of what I want to talk about in the Triloquy. So back in what year was it? Back in 1967, the late, great James Baldwin wrote an essay called "Negroes Are Anti-Semitic Because They're Anti-White." In this essay, James Baldwin talks about some of the challenges that he faced living in New York City, the anti-Blackness that he dealt with on a daily basis, and the different communities, including some Black folks, who perpetuate that anti-Blackness. In this essay, he names members of Jewish communities being a part of that. So, as we've been talking about as on social media, people have been, having one opinion or another about words of Kanye West. Now we're talking about this NBA player, Kyrie, who has said some things that he is unwilling to apologize for. So through all of these conversations, people have been taking different excerpts from different things and different writings and platforming it to make one point or another. So there was a quote that was taken from this James Baldwin piece that was put on Twitter and that I liked. I did not understand or see the context under which that quote was being platformed. So I was called to the carpet. There were questions about my judgment and my value system because I liked a tweet that quoted this James Baldwin piece. Um, the first thing I want to say before I go any further is that we have to separate this very nuanced conversation from Kanye West. I've said it on this podcast in past weeks. I'll say it again here. I'm categorically opposed to the anti-Semitism that Kanye West has been spreading out there. I haven't paid a whole bunch of attention to what's been going on with that story, but I do believe that has to be said. He was wrong. There's no defending his statements, and there's no affirmation of him necessarily in writings or as they're platformed, in writings by James Baldwin. Now, impact is more important than intent. And I understand how liking a tweet that is misconstrued and taken out of context to support something anti-Semitic, I understand how that, especially for folks who don't know me, can be seen as anti-Semitism on my part. So I'm very sorry for any negative impact liking that tweet had. There are very uncomfortable conversations that are being avoided. And I think it results in the continued segregation of communities, segregation of ideas, and ultimately a separation and continued segregation of human beings. Anti-Semitism is wrong, period. Anti-Blackness is a through line of American culture, and it is utilized by people of all communities, again, even including Black communities. I think it's sometimes hard to really dig into the root causes of some of our biggest, most pernicious issues in this country because there is so much trauma, there is so much hurt. Again, I can understand how a person from a Jewish community could be very hurt by the liking of a quote from a James Baldwin article titled "Negroes are anti-Semitic because they're anti-white." There's a lot of nuance even in that title. And I think that title can even be taken out of context and used to say something that the author didn't mean to say. How do you think uncomfortable conversations like Black anti-Semitism, like Jewish anti-Blackness, and all the other nuances, in the gray area between those things, do you think there's any engagement of those things considering the level of trauma that people are dealing with? Do you think there just needs to be more healing time? We need to get further in the future, further away from the Holocaust, further away from antebellum slavery before we can have the conversation, or what? What are your thoughts on this very nuanced sort of thing?
No, I stay out of it usually because I don't know the nuances. And in fact, I've been learning them over these last few weeks when the whole Kanye thing come up, because I was unaware of a lot of these issues. So I don't know if getting away from the Holocaust or slavery is it, because getting away from it tends to make me think of a forgetting or a putting to bed, a let it be sort of a thing. And I don't think that we need to walk away from either one.
Yeah.
And, I just feel so reluctant. I do a lot of listening in this arena. I just don't understand all the ins and outs like someone like you might.
Maybe about a year ago, maybe longer, here on TRILLOQUY, I had some guests, shout out to Allison Loggins Hull. We talked about the International Contemporary Ensemble's Reparations Now concert, where they talk about the impact of Jewish reparations on Jewish communities, that positive impact, the impact of a lack of reparations for Black people, and how generational poverty is directly tied to that, and every other systemic issue that you can get into that. So the conversation is happening, and it's even happening on a musical level. I was talking to a composer not too long ago, and they were talking about how when they were kids, when they were a kid growing up in New York City, there were like elementary school sort of programs about Black Jewish relations and building communities. So this is a generations long conversation that's been happening. I think at the end of the day, understanding each other through dialogue is the key to progress. I know I asked if we just need to get further away from slavery, but at the end of the day, I think one of the major bits of pain and trauma for people is that lack of reparations to Black people. And it's hard for so many of us, and I'll put myself in that. It's hard for me to not think about that, and to not think about the anti-Blackness inherent in the lack of acknowledgement of that trauma, by the country that perpetuated that trauma. There are so many historical things that, are placed appropriately so on the type of pedestal so that we don't forget, so that we don't repeat history. There's a lot of trauma out there for those of us who are the recipients of an unacknowledgement, at least a real significant acknowledgement of that history. So again, I, at the bottom of my spirit, just apologize for any hurt that liking a tweet that from my perspective lifted up a Black perspective denigrated someone else or another group. That was not my intent. I hope that we can work harder to have dialogue, to see each other, because as so many people say, hurt people hurt people. And I don't think, trying to destroy my character or deplatform me or invalidate the work that I do benefits anything. It doesn't benefit me, and it certainly doesn't benefit any individual or any community that is hurt by certain statements or the way that dialogues are happening these days. I really believe that we have to move forward together. The deeper I lean into my Buddhist practice, the more I see the need for unity across communities. And I just hope that we can all make that goal, even if I am being, as consistent and challenging myself as I can. I think about the Donald Trumps. I think about the David Dukes. I'm forgetting his name right now, but there's a Black blues musician who famously made friends with members of the Ku Klux Klan through dialogue and doing all of that. There was a time in my life when I first learned about that story, I was like, no, never me. I could never. But now being on the other side of some, what at the end of the day is a misunderstanding, I'm trying to consider what it looks like for me to offer grace, to try to see the human and try to meet person to person when it comes to certain things so that everyone can benefit and everyone can be better. Of course, there are, some very real things happening in the world right now when it comes to anti-Semitism, when it comes to anti-Blackness, when it comes to misogyny. These things are anti-immigrant rights and all of those things. The issues are real, and I want to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge that because of the hurt and trauma and pain that comes from those very real subjugations of historically marginalized people, it's very easy for things to get misconstrued and to be contextualized in a way that was not intended. So anyway, all of my long way to say, I hope we can continue dialogue as people. I hope we can find opportunities to get clarity, to really understand what intention is, to be responsible for impact, because that's important as well. Again, impact over intention. and for us all to just get along. I know that's woo woo, and I know that seems just out of reach for a lot of people, especially again, we're here in this midterm season. I don't even want to think about 20 November 2023 when we're talking about presidential elections. I think that's when the vitriol and the division really comes out. But if we can, somehow think about how to turn that trauma into learning, how to turn that poison into medicine, we may be able to reach mutual benefit. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your continued support. We'll see you again next week.